of Stone and Steel by Stephen Williams. Performed by Kristen Holland. Prince Art had been exploring his family's palace ever since his little legs learned to navigate staircases. From the canopies of stained glass to the oceans of marble, there was always something new to discover in the castle. He'd toddle from spire to spire and then return to his bedroom to scribble his progress on one of the original blueprints tacked to the wall. At the age of 8, 2/3 of the plan remained uncharted. He had quite the quest ahead of him. One destination that sparked his interest was a spacious courtyard deep in the palace guts. But after following the twisting hallways, he found the only entrance sealed with a dozen rusted locks. Standing on his tiptoes and squinting through the door's peephole, he was able to make out a small castle surrounded by dead grass. What a funny place, he thought. He'd have to talk to his mother about it. That night, after he'd brushed his teeth and crawled into bed, he asked the Queen about the mysterious ruin. "I suppose you could use a bedtime story," she sighed. "But it is a bit scary. Do you think you can handle it?" Prince Art was always up for a challenge. Besides, the scary ones were his favorites. The boy cocooned himself in blankets, and the Queen began. Not that long ago there was a king, she said. He was kind and loved throughout the land. But this love had also made him naive and prideful. Despite all of its pleasures, love can wear away a person's strength, the way a river smooths stones. The king that ruled the neighboring empire was strong, and he took note of the kind king's laziness. He decided to invade, and in almost no time at all, his army stood waiting at his enemy's portcullis. But the strong king was not without mercy, and he made the kind king a fair offer. All he had to do was surrender, and he'd be allowed to take his family to live out the rest of their days in the country. The kind king sneered at the proposition. "You'll never breach these walls," the kind king cried from the battlements. "And if you want me to give up my kingdom, you'll have to come in and get us." The strong king had the numbers, the weapons, the will, but he knew a prolonged siege would be a bloody endeavor that could decay his troops' morale. That's when he came up with a brilliant plan. Instead of breaching the walls and dragging the stubborn royal family, guards and servants out into the sunlight, he'd entomb them in their own beds. Immediately, the strong king's builders began to construct the largest palace the world had ever seen, one that would devour the tiny castle on the hill. All estates need a name, and as the materials were shipped in, the strong king decided to call his new home Tartarus. As hundreds of stonemasons cut the granite that would form the innermost walls, the kind king called every soul in his palace to the throne room for an announcement. "Let them build," he growled as his friends and family looked on silently. "We have drink, we have food, we have sunshine, and we have each other. We'll make it through this darkness." Before construction could begin, they needed a foundation. The strong king's men fitted every wrist for 1,000 miles with shackles and forced picks and shovels into their hands. The army of slaves cleaved the earth until they reached the edge of hell. Then they filled the trenches with obsidian and molten iron. This base dammed up all the natural water flowing into the tiny palace and severed its pipes like a guillotine through veins. "No matter," the kind king chuckled. "Who needs water when you have wine? Let's celebrate." They danced and partied until the cellar was empty. Wine dribbled down their chins and stained the thick, feathery carpet. They sunk up to their shins in the plush material, and running their toes through it felt like heaven. They still had sunshine, food, and companionship. The kind king could hear his children playing. Everything was going to be okay. As the strong king positioned pillars as tall as mountains, the kind king's family passed the time on their veranda. They soaked up the sun, chatted, played cards, until the builders sealed the sky with a black dome. The royal family's estate had been transformed into an egg of stone and steel. The claustrophobia was suffocating. "Enough of this gloom," the kind king declared. "Light some candles, let's have a feast." Every room was filled with wax sticks and fire, every room smothered in glowing hope. Roasted pigs, berry preserves, and fresh bread poured out of the kitchen. They ate until there was nothing left, and the buttons popped from their clothes, ricocheting throughout the dining room. With his belly full, the kind king could still hear his children playing. Everything was going to be okay. It was what came next that the king wasn't prepared for. Silence. No more demands, no more construction. They were left alone in their little castle, and the outside world was moving on without them. The memory of their dynasty faded like the chirping birds after the dome had been riveted into place. Melancholy rained down. Their supplies dwindled. Time became their true enemy. As the kind king's stomach growled and his tongue grew dusty, his staff vanished one by one. In the shadows, he could see the silhouettes of his remaining servants licking greasy fingers. They clutched wine glasses in their talons, making the red liquid inside waltz along the walls. "I thought we were out of food and wine," he called weakly from his throne. "We are," the servants replied. He couldn't hear his children playing. One by one, the candles began to wink out. With them all burnt to worthless stubs, the kind king limped from his throne. He called for help, but only the echo of his own withered voice replied. Where had everyone gone? Had they found a way out and surrendered? He needed someone. His hunger and loneliness were threatening to peel his mind like an onion. It only took one step on the stained carpet to find his companions. He felt a crunch beneath his loafer, and then another. Buried in the fabric were dozens of brittle skulls. The smooth surface of many of them had been riddled with chew marks. His palace had become a graveyard. The kind king could no longer stand the weight of his crown. He collapsed to the floor, took a final breath, and turned to dust. His pride and love had been enough to sustain him for a while, but in the end, his bones joined the others. The queen finished with a smile. The prince had buried himself in pillows, shivering as the tale reached its conclusion. "Could something like that ever happen to us?" he whispered. "Of course not, you silly boy," his mother said, "but make sure you go straight to sleep, otherwise you may not grow up to be one of the strong kings." She gave him a wink and a sloppy kiss on the forehead. As he drifted to sleep, the queen turned to the window to watch the sunset in peace. She was able to make out the base of a new wall along the horizon. A dark, smooth line. It reminded her of the way blood pooled between tiles. Her husband, the strong king, had also been blinded by his own conquests. And their neighbor, the bloodthirsty king, had noticed. Now that he had borrowed their tactics, the sun would be setting a few hours earlier by the end of the year. Before her precious prince had learned to shave, the sun would be gone.